Hi folks, my name is David DuChemin. I'm a world and humanitarian photographer, and this is the heart of the photograph. This is a virtual lecture that I've been giving for the last couple of years, and it's based on my book, The Heart of the Photograph. I shamelessly stole the title. This book came out in March, in fact, March 17th, 2020, just as the world was going into a pandemic. And it was, in fact, I remember this so clearly because it was the day that Amazon also announced they would not be sending books to the rest of the world. And it was an inauspicious day to begin this book, The Heart of the Photograph. I'm very excited about the presentation that I'm about to give you because I think this is in many ways, the real work where it comes to making photographs. So often photographers get very stuck on issues of gear. We talk about technique, and all of those things are important, but insufficient. There is so much more that goes into making a photograph, especially if what we want is a photograph that moves, a photograph that is compelling, something that is not only visual, but visceral, something that we can feel and really experience. So I want to start by telling you a bit of a story. And when I started as a travel photographer, I very excitedly booked flights to go to Kathmandu, Nepal. And I got to Kathmandu, and of course, I had all my gear, and I woke up the first morning, and I was so excited to get out there and experience this place. And as you know, photography is more than just what we see. We hear things, we smell things. Of course, we also see things, and those lead to eventually they guide our curiosity, and they pull us into moments that we can photograph. And I was wandering through the streets of Kathmandu. It was really early in the morning. The sun was not quite up yet. And I could smell the fires starting. I could hear the rickshaws and the motorcycles. But the one thing I could hear over everything else was this drum. And as I walked into the Tibetan side of town, an area called Bodhanath, I heard this drumming, this just boom, boom. And I thought, where there is a drum, there must be a drummer. So I started to explore, and I got lost in a couple alleys, but eventually I found myself in front of these big red doors, and behind the doors could hear this boom, boom. And it was regular enough that I thought, there's something going on here. But of course, I was a little bit nervous because when you open a door like that, and you have no idea what's behind it. I thought there'd be 500 monks sitting there and sort of stare at me awkwardly. But I opened the door, and the room was dark except for one window on the far end, and the light was just starting to come up, and so there was a beam of light that was coming through this window. And sitting there in this beam of light was this monk, and he was dressed in his saffron and his crimson robes, and he was chanting, and every now and then he would hit this drum, and he had this very guttural, very sort of primordial sound to his voice. And this is not, by the way, what he was chanting, but it had that is sort of a boom, and he would hit his drum, and then he would chant boom, and it felt not only like I was on the other side of the world, if not a different world entirely, but that I had traveled back in time 500 years and was experiencing this moment that I never imagined I would experience. And the reason that I show you the photograph that I'm showing you is not because it came out of that moment. In fact, it came later that day. In that moment, I didn't get the photograph that I wanted to, but the experience will live with me for the rest of my life. And I remember as I was listening to this monk chant, he looked up at me, and I tapped my camera as if to say, is this okay? And he nodded and, said yes. And so I started making photographs, and he was chanting and drumming, and I was photographing, and we were coexisting in this beautiful ancient moment. And he looked up and he said, "What kind of camera is that?" And I was so shocked. I was so taken by surprise that I had to actually turn my camera and look at the badging on it. Well, it's a Canon, and that seemed to satisfy him. And he went back to chanting, and I was still in shock, trying to make as best I could a photograph of this moment. And he went back to chanting and drumming, and he looks up and he says, is that the new 5D Mark II? And again, I was shocked, and yes, it is. And so quickly, this ancient moment is dissolving in front of me, and he goes back to drumming and chanting, and he looks up one more time. He says, "Could I have a copy of one of these photographs?" I said, "Of course," and I reached into my vest pocket and I pulled out my notebook and my pen, and I imagined I would write his name and address, and I would go home to Canada and I would print these with love and care and package them and send them off to Kathmandu. And he hands me his business card. He says, "Just send me an email." And I still remember it was something like llama69@hotmail.com. And it was, the reason I tell you the story was because the experience was so exceptional. It was so out of the ordinary for me, and will be something that I remember for the rest of my life. And it may actually be an okay thing that I didn't get a photograph that was worth keeping from that experience, because every time I tell the story, it kind of gets better and better. And in my memory, this is something that will live forever. But the word experience is very important to me, not only because the camera itself has been the impetus for experiences around the world. I have met with cultures that I would not otherwise have no reason to interact with. I've met with people that I otherwise wouldn't have met or spent time with. I've encountered species that otherwise I would not have, without the camera being there, I would have no reason to have encountered. The camera gives me this extraordinary experience of life, and I suspect it's one of the reasons that you photograph. It makes us more aware, it makes us more alive in that moment. And when people look at my photographs, I think the highest praise they can give me is to say, "Wow, I just feel like I'm there. I really feel present there." And as I mature as a photographer, and I've been doing this now for 35 years, I realize that's what the camera does for me too. It makes me feel like I'm really there. It makes me feel more alive. And I value that. I value that experience as a photographer. But where this connects to our topic today is the experience of the person responding to our photographs, I think, is also important. And one of the questions that I think seldom ask when we're talking about technique and composition and all of these things that are the subject of popular photography magazine articles is, what do human beings respond to in a photograph? How can we make photographs that that, as I said before, are more than just visual but are visceral? How can we do that with the tools of our craft? So I want to talk about that today, but one of the things that I want to do first is show you some of my work. And so I'll show you a few of the images that I've made over the years, and the reason I want to do this is not to show you my portfolio. I want to give you a sense of why I photograph and the priorities that I have, because I think that informs how we talk about things today. It informs what you're going to take away from this lecture. So you're looking at a photograph of my boatman, Hira. This is made on the Ganges River in Varanasi, India. And Hira would show up every day and remind me as I got into the boat. Every day for 3 weeks would remind me, Hira means diamond. And I would say, yes, Hira, I understand that. And he would row me up and down the Ganges, and we would talk. And what I want out of a photograph like this is it's not a long lens shot. It's not a sneaky hip shot when he's not looking. I want to be right there, and I want you, or the person responding to my photograph, to feel like they're right there. And so you will see in many of my images, you will see a lower point of view, a very close point of view. You'll see me using a lot of ultra wide angle lenses. You'll see me playing with depth. And some of these are things, depth especially, point of view, these are things to which we respond in a photograph. They're not just, where should I put the camera? It's a much bigger topic than that. It's what will people respond to when they look at this photograph, this flattened two-dimensional image, what will they respond to? I made this in Jamaica, and actually the only thing I remember about that trip was this moment, and the encounter that I had. I still remember the man's name. His name was Robert, and his horse's name was Pretty Boy. And what I want out of a photograph like this is that feeling, forgive the pun, of immersion. I want you to feel like you're there, and you couldn't get a photograph like this from the shore with a 300 millimeter lens. You wouldn't get that beautiful sweeping wave that is out of focus in the foreground that kind of pulls us in and makes us feel like we're in the water. Because I was in the water, and if you want to put your viewer somewhere, you need to put the camera there. There's no substitute for being there and having the camera there. But those wider lenses give us that energy of the wave and the beautiful clouds that kind of lead into the image. Again, forgive the pun, but depth is a really important thing in a photograph. It's not the only thing, and there are photographs that are made that are more flattened or plainer, and that's okay too, but we do respond to depth. The more we can introduce the illusion of spatial depth in a photograph, the more we feel like we're actually there, because that's how we see the world, very immersed, peripherally. We see the world kind of, this much, not like this. And so the more we can introduce that to our photographs, the more opportunity we have to create that experience for the people responding to our images. This was made in Istanbul in Turkey. It's a little cafe, and you'll see here too, again, a bit of a lower point of view, very close out of focus foreground elements, and that hand, that disembodied hand coming in. One of the things that I so love about this craft is that we make raw materials out of light and time, and these moments, unless you're photographing still lifes, these moments very often never repeat themselves. They in the history of time, this particular moment, this juxtaposition of all these elements will never repeat itself. And I'm always looking for that feeling of the unrepeated and the mystery of things. I think it's important that we don't always show everything. The fact that hand, is that hand mine? Is it someone else's? I love a sense of mystery. And that, though we won't really talk about mystery today, is one of the things that we respond to. Mystery makes us ask questions. It makes us wonder, what's going to happen next. One of the other things that we respond so strongly to is juxtaposition or contrast. And I think it ties into this idea of mystery, because it makes us sit forward. It's often contrast is, or the difference between things, especially the difference between ideas, it makes us, it's unresolved. It makes us ask questions. It hooks our imagination and makes us kind of lean in. It drives story in our photographs. So this photograph was made in Venice. It's one of the few without an ultra wide lens. And on the left, you see there's this beautiful sort of contrast of tableaus. You get on the left this solitary man. His evening, it looks like it's coming to an end. The wine glasses are empty. The glass across from him has got a napkin stuffed into it, and so it looks like his evening has come to an end. Whereas on the right, you have this young couple whose evening looks like it's just beginning. They've just started drinking their wine. They may just have clinked their glasses. He's still got his cap on. And the contrast here, or the juxtaposition, is one of solitariness or solitude, aloneness, versus togetherness. And so we'll talk a little bit about contrast and juxtaposition as something that hooks us and that engages us in a photograph, and how we can use that to our advantage. This photograph is also in Istanbul, and again, it's that mystery. What are they looking at? What is on that iPhone screen that has them so engrossed and making such a variety of facial expressions? The fact that we don't know, but we recognize them, we feel them. We, as human beings, we actually feel empathy. Something in our brain, when we see someone else smiling, we kind of want to smile. When we see them looking curious or wondering at something, we feel these things. And so if we can put these into our photograph, if we can be conscious of them as we choose our moments, and later too in the edit, when you're going from hundreds of photographs down to one or two, being aware of these ideas, I think, will be really helpful. We'll talk about some of these today. even when I photograph wildlife, I'm not looking for a document of record. I'm not looking for you to go away from this photograph and say, oh, okay, now I more fully understand what a hammerhead shark looks like. I want you to go away with some kind of feeling, either for those of you who love sharks, going away thinking, wow, that's really cool, or those of you who don't love sharks kind of going away and having nightmares. But I want you to feel something in the images that I make. This is a spirit bear, and it's probably the photograph that's made closest to home for me. Many of my photographs are made somewhere else, and I show you this picture for two reasons. One, because this picture too, I think you can feel the passage of time. What I want this photograph to be about it determines whether I use, for example, a slower shutter speed, so you can feel that passage of time. But I also show it to you because I want to acknowledge that many of my photographs are made in more exotic locations, but I don't think they succeed merely because they are exotic. A man in India wearing a turban does not a good photograph make necessarily. So no matter what kind of photography you do, as we go through this and we talk through this lecture, I want you to be aware that the ideas that we're talking about are what are important, and they can apply to no matter the genre. Whether you do portraiture or landscapes or travel photography, no matter what you do, I think these ideas can be instrumental in helping you make stronger photographs that not only you feel stronger about, but other people that aren't there, that may never be there, can feel. And I think that as we make photographs, one of the questions that we're always asking is this: is it good? I think is it good is a question that preoccupies photographers. And you see this reflected in popular photography magazines. You'll see conversations about whether it's a good picture, and we extend this language to our gear, the best landscape lens, what's better, what's best. And one of my concerns, and the reason that I bring this up, is I think is it good is a completely moving target. The photograph that you look at and say, wow, that's a great photograph, whether it's one that you've made or someone else has made, will depend your judgment of that will depend on where you are in your craft, what your personal preferences are, what you've been exposed to, what you understand about this craft or about the subject. And then there's the other sticky issue, which is, what is there a objectively true way of answering this question? Is it good? For example, is it that every image must be well exposed and sharp? When for some artists, they're doing intentional camera movement, and in fact, what they want is motion and blur and a softness. Maybe the abstract photographer will answer the question, is it good, in a way that a more literal photographer, maybe a landscape photographer, would answer completely differently. So good is a moving target, and then of course the person, you show your picture to a judge at a competition, and they will judge it differently than you might judge it. And the person that you show it to on Instagram that only wants to see pictures of kittens and puppies, if you don't show them kittens and puppies, they may not think it's a particularly good photograph either. And I think we can do better than good. I think when we ask good, and we're asking good for whom, things get very muddled. And so in this conversation, I think it's very important that, first of all, we're going to go beyond good. We're going to talk about something better than that. But I think the most important thing, and this is sort of an umbrella that I want to drape over the entire conversation, is it yours? Is it the photograph you want to make? Because I think a photograph's only good in as much as it does what you set out to accomplish. Does it feel a certain way? Does it communicate a certain thing? Only you know what you're making this photograph for. Only you know what you're trying to say with it and what it needs to be about, what kind of mood or emotion or information or impact. There are so many things that we might want to accomplish with an image. And before we ask any other questions, especially about other people and their thoughts on our image, we need to have the freedom to ask ourselves, is this the photograph I want to make. And then to be very aware of that, because only we can then make the decisions that will make that photograph what we want it to be. Do I need a fast shutter speed? Do I need a tighter aperture? Do I need a wider lens? Too often in the pursuit of, a good photograph, we ask ourselves, what lens should I use? And there are no shoulds. There is no obligation in photography, only creative opportunity. So what lens could you use to accomplish the thing you're trying to accomplish, to make it feel the way you want it to feel? So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And when I say we can do better than good, I have kind of two ideas that I want to pursue. The first is better subjects. And by this I actually mean better awareness of your true subject. So I'm well known for splitting hairs, and today will be no different. So let me give you an example. I make a difference or a distinction between what a photograph is of and what a photograph is about. So in the photograph that you're seeing here, this is a grizzly bear. It's a sleeping grizzly bear. And any photograph that I made of this bear would be of a grizzly bear. But not every photograph would be about what this particular image is about. This image has a restfulness to it. It's about a bear in repose, and the choice of moment with the eyes closed and the resting posture, as opposed to, for example, a more alert bear looking at something, ears perked up, chin off the paws. It would be about a different thing. And the point of view in this photograph helps make this about what it's about, low in the grass with some out of focus foreground elements. Everything contributes. Whereas if you look at a photograph like this too is of a grizzly bear, arguably of 3 grizzly bears, but it's of the same stuff. But it's about something very different. The first image is about repose, it's about restfulness. This is about play. This is about family dynamics. There's a mother on the left side, and she's taken a moment out, and there's 2 sibling bears. There's a brother and a sister, and it's the sister that's lying on her back about to bring the smack to the brother. And it's the choice of moment that makes this what it is about, and the composition, and the choice of lens. And if you or I were there, and there was someone sitting to my left, and you were sitting to my right, the person to my left may have chosen to make this. It would all be of the same stuff, but they would have chosen to make an image about something maybe very different. They may have chosen a longer lens and just focused on that mother bear on the left side and made a portrait at a particular moment. And what that photograph would be about, the emotions that it would evoke, would be different from the photograph that I made that you're looking at here, and different from the one that you on my right, sitting there in the boat, might have chosen to make. You might have chosen only to focus on the relationship between the sister and the brother, and that playful play fighting that they're doing, and make a photograph. All 3 of us would have made photographs of the same thing, but we would have made photographs about different things. And then the frame that you choose in the edit, and then the way that you post-process the scene. One of us might make a photograph that was in black and white. One would go much more contrasty and saturated and a little bit more literal. Here I've played with the colors a bit just to bring them down, to soften them and make them a little bit more storybook. Whereas you might choose to make a set of decisions so that photograph becomes about something so much more. So let me give you another example in just a second. Really, the question we're trying to answer is, what are you trying to say with this photograph? And you do have to choose. You can't say everything. When we make a photograph, we're really saying to someone, look at this. And the question is, well, look at what? And how do I look at it? You need to guide us. You need to exclude certain things and include certain things. You need to choose the right moment. You need to choose the right emotion. And do you use a slower shutter speed? Do you isolate with depth of field? What are you trying to say? What is this photograph about? So let me give you another example. This is a little girl in northern Kenya. And so a photograph of a little girl, right? But about Well, it's about fear. It's about nervousness. It's about timidity. You can see it in her, her hands are sort of covering her. She's hiding. She's got her arms in nice and tight, and she's not even looking at us. She's looking at grandmother off the frame. There is a very real, palpable sense of timidity here, if not outright fear. And so this photograph is of a little girl, but about something much more. The next photograph, it's of the same girl. It's all the stuff in the frame is the same, except it's about something so much different. It's about joy. It's about that freedom, that feeling, and it's a happy feeling, right? It's about something completely different. And so, when I talk in a moment about that distinction between of versus about, and then giving the best expression to what this photograph is about, this is another example, because if what I really want is for this photograph to be about happiness, about that freedom, that joy, a better expression of this moment, as opposed to the previous one, might be the full color version. You might look at this and just go, oh yeah, the other one feels happy, but this feels happier. This gives better expression to that. So the reason I'm showing you these is to help you understand the difference between a photograph that is of something versus about something. And our photographs will become more compelling as we become very clear in our thinking about what that true subject is, that theme, that story, that feeling. What is the photograph about for you? And then how do we make choices that give that better or best expression? And the beautiful thing is we get to choose. You get to choose what that photograph is about for you. So again, not is it good, but is it yours? Are you making these decisions? And then what do we need to do with things like optics and the moment we include and our composition, the shutter speed, the aperture, all of these things in order to give best expression in the camera, in the edit, and then in post-production or development. Always asking ourselves, what's this about? What is this one frame about? And am I giving it its best expression? What could I do to make it stronger, to amplify that? So I've got 3 quotes here for you. The first one is from Russian poet Anton Chekhov, and he says, don't tell me, and by the way, he's speaking to other poets here, much as I'm a photographer speaking to other photographers. He says, don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. I love that. Don't tell me, show me. French-American painter Robert Henry, a similar context. He's talking to he's talking to painting students, and he says, paint the flying spirit of the bird rather than its feathers. And I kind of imagine him saying, rather than just its feathers. Anyone can paint the feathers. Paint the flying spirit of the bird. And American magnum photographer David Allen Harvey says, don't shoot what it looks like, shoot what it feels like. And I'm so on board with this sentiment, and you might be too, but of course the next question is, how? That's all well and good, David Allen Harvey, but how do I do that? And that is what we're going to talk about for the next portion of this presentation. I believe that the heart of the photograph is the subject's best expression. And you decide that. You're thinking about your own desires, your own tastes, your own preferences, what you want to say with this image, and then you're choosing the ways in which you might say that most compellingly, considering what other people will engage with in a photograph. What they will, for example, mood and emotion and things that kind of grab our imaginations. How can we do that with the photographs that we make? So we talked about better subjects, and now we're going to talk about better expression of those true subjects or the thing that your photograph is about. So the first question that I ask, and this, by the way, is a series of questions. They're not yes, no answers that you're going to give. They're the kind of questions that you ask that have a number of different possibilities, a number of different creative responses. They beg us to try new things and to risk and to move the camera around. So they're actionable, and that's what I think makes a good question in terms of our creative process. So when I first learned to make photographs, it wasn't very subtle or nuanced. In fact, most of the time when we learn something new, it's kind of, you start with the basics. And so I learned, at the time I had a Pentax Spotmatic and I was shooting black and white film, and the first lessons were all about how much light was out there and how to expose properly for it. So how much light was a bit of an obsession at the beginning, because that was the big thing. I could focus, but getting the right amount of light, with the simple tools that I had with this older Pentax, was a challenge. But as I grew, the question of how much light became less important. As I became familiar with how to expose the camera, it became much more important that I asked, what kind of light? And more importantly, and so this is where there's a bit of a, this slide should actually say, what is the light doing? And what can I do with the light? Because it's our choices where light is concerned that make the final photograph. So, for example, you don't look out. This is a photograph that's backlit. The sun is very low and it's shining through the dust that's being stirred up by these farm animals. And you don't look at a scene like this, you don't jump out of the Land Rover and go, oh my gosh, how lucky am I? It's backlight today, as though it were some kind of weather phenomenon like, oh, it's raining. We see and experience light, and especially as photographers, through our choices. And you, for example, might have got out of the Land Rover right beside me. The light was coming, when I got out of the vehicle, coming over my shoulder and front lighting the scene. And I see that light and it's hitting the dust, and my first thought is, I gotta backlight this, because I love seeing light come through dust rather than reflect it. But you may have seen something completely different, and you may have thought, oh my gosh, I've got to photograph this in this particular way in response to the light. Whereas I'm thinking, I gotta backlight it. So you're asking, what's the light doing? But more than that, you're asking, what can I do with this? Maybe the light's giving you great shadows. Maybe it's a really high dynamic range scene, and that allows you to, in this case, underexpose by 3 stops so that the figures become more silhouetted and you regain some of the texture and detail in the sky. Maybe you move a little bit so that sun just peeks out from behind the shepherd that's carrying the little lamb. You might make very different choices. The wonderful thing about photography is that our camera sees light totally differently. So while you and I can't over or underexpose with our eyes, the camera can, and we can regain a mood or amplify a mood in an image in a way that we can't do with our eyes. We can see some of that, we can see the possibility, but asking ourselves, not only what is the light doing, but what can I do with it? Can I underexpose it by a few stops and bring back the thing? Because again, any picture you could have pulled out your iPhone and made a photograph of this scene, you would have had a picture of the same stuff. But a photograph that is about what this is about, and the mood, and having that silhouette, and having the sheep and the goat stirring up that dust, it's your choices about those things that make the photograph what it is about. Here's another example. This is northern Ethiopia, and the context is a little bit important here. This is a Christmas pilgrimage, and so very, not just metaphorically, but very literally, this pilgrimage is about going from darkness into light. And so this is a cave that's been hollowed out by human hands, and beyond the door that they are all facing and going through is a church out in a churchyard, also carved out of stone. And so when I got to this scene and was asking, what is the light doing? The answer was kind of nothing. I love backlight. I will shoot backlight all day long, but in this case, the light was coming straight on. All I could see, was kind of blinding. All I could see was the backs of heads. It wasn't the back. In this case, backlight was not going to give best expression to what I wanted this scene to be about. So I moved. I got around to the side, asking myself, what can I do with this? And not really knowing. So the answer is, well, let's find out. So you move with your camera, and you look through the viewfinder, and you play with your exposure. You see what the histogram is telling you. And in this case, I needed the mystery. This photograph was about mystery and the mood and the anticipation, the waiting, the upturned gaze of this one gentleman. And so I underexposed this as well, or that's what my camera thought. I was actually properly exposing it for the brightest spots of the garments. And in this case, I'm just watching my histogram. And I'm not asking, am I losing any detail in the highlights? I'm asking, which highlights am I losing? And especially in this image, I'm asking which shadow details am I losing? And does it matter? Because the histogram police aren't around. They're not with me when I'm making the photograph. I get to choose. And in this case, no one has ever looked at this picture and said, well, it's okay, but I sure wish I could see more detail on the rock wall that they're in front of. This is a cave. I wish I could see into the corners. Well, yes, you would get more information that way, but you would lose all of the impact. And so it's important that we pursue excellence of craft. And it's important we understand about our histograms. It's not that you are losing shadow detail necessarily. It's which shadow detail are you losing, and is that important to you? And what's the trade-off, right? If you gain a lot of detail in the shadow and you lose all the mood, if you gain information but lose impact, is that a trade-off that you're willing to make? It's not for me, not in a picture like this. For me, mood and emotion is everything in a photograph like this. And so when you look at the light, ask yourself, not only what is it doing, but what can I do with it? What can I do with the shadows it's giving me, the reflections? And can I change it? Can I modify it slightly? Do I need to use a strobe? That's not my way. I don't use flashes, but I will often use a diffusion panel if I'm making portraits, or maybe you just need to wait. Maybe you look at the light and what it's doing is nothing particularly special for what you want to accomplish. And you need to wait. That's what you can do. You can wait until the sun slightly changes. Maybe it comes down to a better angle on the landscape and gives you a warmer light. Maybe it gives you longer shadows. Sometimes that's what we do. We wait, but asking, what is the light doing and what can I do with it can be a very important question as we pursue photographs that are, again, visceral, something that we feel, not merely visual. Any picture I made of this scene would have been of these pilgrims, but would it have been about the mystery? Would it have been about that mood? It depends on the choices that you make. So this next question is, as some of my questions are, is a little bit odd. It not only do I want to encourage you to ask when is the moment, when is the strongest moment, when is the moment that reflects the thing that you want this photograph to be about, but where is the moment? And I realize that's a bit of an odd question, but the reason I ask it that way is because I think it's important we understand that unless you're photographing still lifes, generally speaking, when things are happening in time, the composition of our images changes. Things are also moving through space, specifically the space in our frame. They are moving through the frame itself, but also moving relative to other elements. And the question is that what you want in terms of what you're trying to say with the photograph? Is it the strongest expression of your subject? So this photograph, it was very important, and when I say very important, it was very important to my client that I be making photographs that were about not only of these Samburu shepherds in Kenya, but about their relationship with water. So this is a singing well, and I'll explain that in a second, but he's dumping water into a hole, the water goes through another hole, and on the other side of that beautiful curve, there is a trough where his camel and cattle will be drinking the water. In the hole that you see, the dark area that you see in the lower left of the frame, that's a hole. It goes all the way down to the water table, and it's a very arid part of Kenya, and that water is a long way down. So there's like 8 or 9 guys in that hole, and they're all passing buckets up, and they're singing, and as they sing, the noise kind of reverberates up that stone wall, and it comes out just this force. It's beautiful. None of which I could really put into the photo, but I could put the relationship of this one shepherd in water. Everything else looks dry. It's in part because it's concrete and it's dry, but there's no signs of life except for this guy in the water. And the moment was really important to me. I could not just have shown up, made one photograph, and moved on, because I just wouldn't have got the shot. I would have had maybe a picture with the bucket in front of the face. Maybe he had poured the water and it was already all gone, and then it's not a photograph about this guy and the water. It's a photograph of a guy with an empty bucket, and that was not what my client was asking for. So the moment is so important. The specific moment, if you look through the contact sheets of some of the great photographers, the Robert Doisneaus and the Henri Cartier-Bressons and the Steve McCurrys, and you look through them, and there is always that one picture that's just, the other ones are, they're okay, but there's that one. And the reason it's so good is because that choice of moment. And I want to encourage you to spend more time. The way to get exposure to more moments is to spend more time. You've got to be there. I must have been there for at least an hour just with this one guy, photographing, asking questions. And that's after I spent time with him, before the camera even came out of my bag. You've got to spend time. And I know the question is, well, what if I don't have time? And then I would just encourage you, stop listening to the voice of, the fear of missing out. Oh, I got to go somewhere else. I got to photograph something different. Give it a little more time. If you can give it 20 minutes, give it 40. If you can give it 40, give it an hour and a half, but give it more time. That's my first recommendation. And the second is that you not be afraid to put your camera on burst mode. It doesn't have to be 30 frames a second. You can put it on a low burst mode and shoot 3 or 5 frames a second, so that when you do the edit later on, because when you're photographing is not the time to be wearing the editor's hat. That's later. In the moment, you need to be responding to the cues that are there and shooting a little bit more instinctively. But you do, in the edit, you do need more photographs. You need the creative possibilities and be able to look through the pictures and go, oh, that's close, but oh, that one is the one when the bucket just lifts off the hand just a little bit and the water is not quite fully out, but it's got some force to it. That's the one where there's some water drops in front of the face, or the one where the hand pulls back just to clear the face and the eyes make contact with the water. There's often one that is so much stronger than the others just because of the moment. And if you're not shooting through the scene, if you're not really milking it, I'm not talking pray and spray here. I'm talking a very intentional approach to making multiple frames. I call them sketch images, so that when you are in the edit later and you're choosing that one frame, you have more to work with. Let me show you another photograph that I think illustrates this pretty well. This is a shark off the coast of Mexico, and the shark, as you can see, is turning left away from the fish, who's kind of turned right. So there's a tension here. You've got the tension between predator and prey, but you've got the visual tension as one fish goes one way and one goes the other. This happened very quickly, and I was shooting through the scene, and yes, the choice of this moment, it happened so quickly that you couldn't just wait there and go, that's the one, press the shutter, and I hope I got the shot. You shoot through the scene, and then later, recognizing, when you're doing the edit, you recognize these things and go, that moment. And so I'm often asking myself, when I edit, is that the strongest? Does that give best expression to the scene? Because again, any of the frames from this sequence would have been of a shark and a fish, but they would not have been about the same thing. They wouldn't necessarily have that same tension, the same juxtaposition of predator and prey. And so, and also just the fact that tail was sweeping along the dome of my camera, some of the frames just didn't look very, for lack of a better way of expressing it, they didn't look very sharky. The shark kind of, if you weren't there and didn't know, you'd be sort of like, what am I looking at here? And maybe if the fish had turned to swim away from the camera, then all you'd see is sort of the backside of the fish, and it would have looked like a squiggle, a bit of schmutz on my sensor, not a fish. So your choice of moment is so important, not only in terms of the composition, but in terms of the messaging, in terms of the person looking at the picture later on and going, that's a fish, rather than that might be some sensor gunk on David's camera. The choice of moment is so important. So take your time, shoot through the scenes, and don't be afraid to put your camera on burst mode. All right, this one I could go all day on. And the question is, what is my POV or perspective? And POV stands for point of view. It's a cinematic term, and it really just means where do we put the camera in order to give our true subject its best expression? How do we put the camera somewhere creatively to make this more than a photograph of something, but make it truly about something more? And I think this is a missed opportunity for a lot of photographers. We get out of the car and we see this vista, and we set our camera up on a tripod, or we're walking through the streets, and the scene that we first see is the one that we're responding to. And so we pick the camera up and we start photographing from that perspective. And very often where the camera starts is kind of where the camera finishes. It just doesn't move very much. And I think that's such a missed opportunity, because with the camera to our eye, and the fact that as we move, the elements in the frame also move, gives us such control over things. We can, just by moving the camera, we can move the lines. We can make elements further away from each other or closer together. If you get closer to something, that foreground element gets bigger and the background gets smaller. So in that sense, you're rearranging the size of the elements in the frame. Spin around an object and you can push them further apart, spin the other way and you can push them, the implied distance between them shrinks, you push them together visually. We have so much control over our scenes, and I want to encourage you to consider your point of view or your perspective all the time. Be second guessing yourself all the time. Could I move the camera? Could I put it somewhere different? This is a shepherd from Lesotho. Lesotho is a country in the kind of in the middle of South Africa. There's a little bit of a donut hole there. That is the mountain kingdom of Lesotho. And these cowboys are tough. They're like, well, sorry, they're not cowboys. They're shepherds, but they are like the cowboys of Lesotho. And I really wanted that feeling. That kind of these guys are gritty. They're kind of badasses, and they all have a bit of a Clint Eastwood to them. And I wanted to show that. And so I stumbled upon this guy, and I pulled my Leica out, and I was making, he was cool about it, and I was making some portraits, but they weren't very interesting, I gotta tell you, because the first foray was really just to kind of get him comfortable and just to get my creative juices flowing. And so he was standing against this corrugated steel backdrop, and I was shooting like straight on at him. And so it was kind of a mugshot. It was just a set of horizontal lines with a dude in a balaclava, and it wasn't very interesting. But as I started to get comfortable with him and he was kind of cool with me, I started considering my options for moving the camera. And this, what you're looking at now, is shot through there was a door that kept opening up, and I noticed that it had a crack in the glass. So I just propped the door open with my foot between my subject and I, this gentleman. And so that immediately it did a couple things. It gave me that fractured glass, which introduces some tension. It feels like maybe it's kind of like a bullet hole from, the Wild West. And I wanted that feeling of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it also gave me depth. Now the eye follows these corrugations to a vanishing point. Now you can see those clapboard buildings and the dusty road and the hill in the background. And importantly, now he's not looking straight at me. Now he's kind of forced to give me a bit of side eye. And that introduces some tension as well. And the only thing I did from those first images to this was change my point of view. I just put that pane of glass between me and this gentleman, but everything as far as the impact of the image changed. This is northern Kenya again, and what I love about this image, there's a couple things that I really like, but the one that just gets me is her gesture. And I didn't ask her to do this, I couldn't have planned it, but her gesture as she does this with her hand, she basically, it is implied that she's throwing the full moon into the sky. She's casting it into the sky. There's sort of a quality of her being like a shaman. There's just something sort of supernatural and to me, very amazing about the coincidence of the moment and the moon. But it has everything to do with point of view. So if I had shot this photograph from standing up, I'm 6 feet tall, so I would be standing up and I would be shooting down on this woman. She was a very petite woman. She's on the ground. So there'd be not only a lot more dirt, because I'd be shooting down on this woman instead of along the earth towards her. But it would have implied something about the messaging too. It would have implied a power on my part, looking down at her. It would have been very condescending. And that's not what I'm about. I'm very uncomfortable with that. I want my subjects to feel or to look dignified, to look, a little bit larger than life sometimes. And it was really important for me that she stood out. So her sitting in the dirt and me photographing down on her, her figure would not have broken the horizon, or maybe part of it would. Maybe, the horizon would kind of come behind her head. But I wanted more separation. I wanted her to stand above or to rise above the horizon so that I could see that shape. So I was down on my, if I wasn't on my knees, I was sitting and photographing along the ground. So point of view gives me that. It allows that silhouette of her, the shape of her body to rise above the horizon, but that left to right position of my camera is what aligned that hand with the moon above her. And so point of view can be so important. Where we put the camera can be so important to the feel of the photograph as well as the messaging. This is another example. I photographed this in, actually not far from the last photograph. And these women, they knew that we were coming. We were introduced to them. We spent some time talking to them. And they knew that I was photographing. And so I'm not inserting myself into this like a rude tourist. I had their permission. In part, they were there for us to have this meeting. But it was really important to me to get a photograph that was more than just a picture of a bunch of women standing around a tree, because when I first got out of the vehicle, that's all I could see. In fact, all I could see was half the circle, right? Just their backs and this tree. And so the problem then is, well, how do you make it about something more? How do you make it about what's really going on? And so I put on my widest lens, 16 millimeter lens on a 16-35 zoom, and I flipped out my LCD screen and I got the camera as low as I could, and I just kind of danced along with them. I'm a terrible dancer, but I kind of, worked my way into the circle, and they made room for me, and they were very welcoming. And it probably took me about 20, 25, 30 minutes to get the photograph that I really wanted, because I was experimenting with different positions, different compositions, different shutter speeds. I have shutter speeds in the whole sequence of hundreds of frames, from 1 second all the way to something a little bit more like 500th of a second to freeze the action. And some of those slower ones, it was a really good idea that just did not work out, but you gotta try. And so I had that flip down screen out, which, by the way, is about the only commentary I'm gonna make about gear. It doesn't matter whether you're shooting DSLR or mirrorless, whether you're shooting with Sony or Fujifilm. I've shot with everything. But these days, it's really important no matter what I'm shooting. And these days I photograph with Sony gear. But the common thing with all of the gear I've used in the last few years, it all has that articulating screen so that I can put the camera into some great places and not be guessing at the composition, not wonder if I've got it, things level, not wonder if I've got the important stuff in the frame and in the right relationship to each other. I can still see that, and still I can put the camera right to the, right on the edge of the water or around a corner. I can put the camera up or down. So that's my one recommendation. If you're interested in pursuing more creative points of view, consider using the LCD screen on these newer batch of cameras. Even the SLRs these days, if you're using live view, some of the SLRs have fold down screens. But this photograph would not be what it is without that willingness to play and be creative with point of view. All right, can I go deeper? Now this is one that I've played with for a long time, because I think even though our medium is 2 dimensions, I think we can reintroduce the feeling or the illusion of depth, spatial depth in our photographs. And I think we respond to it. And I mentioned this earlier, but I really believe that even though like a 50 millimeter lens is considered our standard, 50 millimeters they say is the most accurate according to how we see the world, but only in magnification. 50 millimeters is still kind of a crop like this. That's not how we see the world. We see the world much more fully. And so reintroducing that, considering the use of wider angle lenses, that depth makes us feel like we're there, or it can make us feel more like we are there. So this is the photograph from the cover of my book, The Heart of the Photograph. It was made in Varanasi, India. And this is almost a perfect example of the rule of thirds, to which I do not generally adhere. But the rule of thirds sort of states that if you divide the frame into 3 portions vertically from left to right and horizontally from top to bottom, that if you put elements of interest at the either on those lines or at the intersection of those lines, that the scene becomes a little bit more interesting. Now, I would argue that it's actually more about whether the scene is dynamically balanced or not. But the point I'm trying to make here is that while this would be a really great example of the traditional rule of thirds, I wonder why we don't think of the rule of thirds not only as the rectangle that our photographs are, but more as a cube. What if, instead of just thinking left to right and top to bottom, we also thought front to back, and we considered the illusion of depth? So in this image, the subframing or the frame within a frame helps. There's kind of no option, unless you're just really interested in, in towels. There's kind of no option except to quickly go, it pulls you in. You kind of do towel, 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 and then there's this window, and it pulls you in to the depth of the image. Those towels and the crossed bamboo poles create a strong foreground that opens then to a strong midground and an interesting background. And so if you're thinking about depth, one of the ways you can do that is to think strong foreground, midground, and background, and play with those. See what works for you, but consider that the stronger that foreground is and the more compelled we are to go through the scene from front to back, the longer we will experience that image, the more it engages our curiosity and our imagination. That's one of the things that makes a compelling image. You want to look at it for longer. This photograph was made, if not on exactly the same day as the last one, but in roughly the same place. This is Varanasi, India, and what makes this photograph is that strong foreground, but not just the strong foreground, the use of a wider lens so that those the lines of those shadows become even more exaggerated. They're much more diagonal. If you'd gone back several meters or yards and used a 50 millimeter lens, you might have still got all the stuff in the frame, but you would have missed these great diagonal lines that pull you in. They are the strong foreground, and they pull you into that midground and then the background beyond. Foreground, midground, background gives you that depth. Those are not the only things that can give depth. We can use light. We can do dodging and burning in the digital darkroom. We can use, again, point of view. This is a wide-angle lens, ultra-wide-angle lens, held quite high, looking down on a circle of drummers. And so your eye begins, you don't just read this left to right or top to bottom, you read it almost in a vortex. You see those clapping hands, you see the motion, and you circle in, probably fairly quickly, to the middle of the image. But then you come back out again and you maybe see details you didn't see the first time. You see that cell phone on the sort of the right top. Then you come down a little and you see the girl with the white head covering. She's looking at that cell phone. So she's obviously kind of getting a selfie made. And then the movement of the hands on the drums. This one is kind of, there's a lot of things going on, but there's such great depth, and part of it is the diagonality of those lines. They suck you into the depth of the image, which in this case is the drum at the center. So consider depth. How can you use depth to pull your viewer in and create, forgive the pun, deeper and more engaging experiences in your photographs? So I've got something that I think will help with that. You're looking at screenshots of 2 of my books. The one on the right is called A Deeper Frame, and actually it's a great example of depth. The foreground element is a rock. There's a long diagonal line leading to the mountains behind it. That alone creates depth. But there's also the color contrast, so you get that warm rock and the cool background. That has the feeling for us of, we read it as separation, and there's depth implied there. The Renaissance painters wrestled with this and finally solved it after thousands of years of painters making very flat two-dimensional images. Finally, at the Renaissance, they began to understand perspective and how the vanishing point made us feel that depth in an otherwise flattened image. And they figured out lighting and shading, and there's a technique called chiaroscuro, which I'll show you in a minute, where chiaroscuro is Italian. It means from light to dark, and it creates a beautiful modeling on subjects, but creates depth. It makes it feel less flat, especially compared to something that's front lit. So A Deeper Frame is an ebook that I wrote a couple of years ago, and I would like you to have it. The Print and the Process is also a book that was traditionally published and is now out of print, and the only way that you can get it is as a PDF. And I'd like you to have both of these. I also will include a PDF of the slideware for this presentation so that you have that. I know that you've got the video, but if it's easier to flip, sometimes it's easier just to flip through a PDF slide deck than it is to fast forward or reverse through a video. So I want you to have that as well. All three of those things you can get if you go to yourbonusresources.com. Just tell me where to send it, and I will send you an email immediately with download links for all three of these resources. I will also begin sending you the contact sheet, which is my it's my effort to continue to connect with and nurture a global photography community on stuff like what we're talking about today, the issues of creativity and composition and craft. And so I send those out every 2 weeks, and I would love for you to get them. There's always an opportunity to unsubscribe if I outlive my usefulness to you. Just hit the unsubscribe button, and you'll be free of me, and I will go cry in the corner. But I want you to have this, yourbonusresources.com. Just tell me where to send it, and they're yours absolutely free. So this next question is a little bit weird too. Very seldom has anyone said to me, "What does my lens say?" And it's not something that most of us learn along the way in our photography. But the reason I word it this way is because I think it's relevant to the topic at hand in terms of how we give better expression to what we're trying to say with our photograph. Our optics can play a huge role in this. Almost every photograph that you've seen depends on, yes, on the light, yes, on the point of view, but it's always in combination, isn't it? It's always a combination of the moment and the light and the point of view and our optics. Our optics are so important to what we do and how we use our optics. There is a common saying among photographers, and I'd love to find out exactly who first said this, that says, zoom with your feet. And the implication is you don't need a longer lens, just get closer to your subject. Or you don't need a wider lens, just back up a bit. And the problem with that is you can zoom or use a different focal length, something longer or something wider. You can use your feet, you can get closer sometimes or move further back. And you can do both together. But they are not the same thing. Zooming, just putting on a different focal length is not the same thing as moving to get closer. The lenses behave differently. They have different angles of view. They have different magnification. They treat space in a different way depending on how you use them. And so when I first started, I had that standard lens. I had a Pentax, so it was a 55 millimeter because Pentax always has to do things differently. And I had a wide lens. In this case, it was a 28 millimeter lens was my first wide angle. And I had a telephoto lens. It was a 200 millimeter. And my understanding of optics was not very subtle or nuanced. I would sort of generally carry my 55 on the front of my camera because that's the standard lens. They wouldn't have called it standard if you shouldn't just kind of have it on as your standard, right? But sometimes you'd see a scene and you'd be like, well, there's a lot of stuff out there that I got to put into the frame. And I'd have to back up a long way to get it in the frame with my standard lens. So you put your wide angle lens on, and the wide angle lens was kind of the put lots of stuff in the frame lens. But there would be other times, you're photographing a duck on a pond. You're like, well, I can't really get any closer. I'm standing right on the edge of the pond. That's when you put the 200 millimeter lens on, right? That's your, make things get closer lens. And like I said, not very subtle or nuanced, but over the years, that understanding has changed. And I've realized that the way that we choose a lens should be based on its behavior. How can we use this lens to say what we want to say, to give best expression to what we're trying to make a photograph about? So in this case, this is a little girl in northern Kenya, and she's in the arms of her grandmother, and this beautiful gesture where she's holding the hand, and there's a little kind of nervousness there. And it was really important to me that I preserve the dignity of this moment. And so my usual go-to lens, the 16 millimeter lens that I want to stick on the front all the time and get in nice and close, not appropriate at all in this circumstance. She would have taken on a very comical aspect. And this is not a comical, the photograph's not about something comical. So expressing it in a comical way makes no sense. So yes, if she'd been smiling or laughing or making big gestures, getting in close with a wide angle lens would have given that much more energy. It would have given her bigger eyes, bigger facial expressions the closer I got. And it would have been really appropriate. But I also would have seen more. I would have seen, the full hut behind her instead of just part of it. I would have seen maybe other huts. I would have seen the mountains in the background, though quite small. This was not what I wanted the photograph to be about. So I put, in this case, an 85 millimeter lens on. 85 millimeter lens is a beautiful kind of in the middle kind of focal length. And I think sometimes we get stuck on this idea that, well, the 85 is a great portrait lens. Well, it depends on what you're trying to say. It sometimes is not at all a great portrait lens, any more than a 16 millimeter lens or a 24 is a great landscape lens, when what you really need is a 300 millimeter. Our choice of optics does not depend on whether it's, a portrait lens or a landscape lens, or it depends on what the lens does, how it behaves, makes space react, how you can move elements related to each other, get a little closer and that foreground element becomes big. Well, that's exaggerated with a wide angle lens. But it's how you use it. You may need to step back with that 300 millimeter lens instead of get right to the edge of the shore and put whatever you've got. Maybe you need to step back and put on an even bigger lens so that you could push that duck up against the reeds in the background and kind of compress the space and make a more pleasing composition. Speaking of 300 millimeter lenses, this is 300 millimeters at f2.8, very shallow depth of field. And it was really important for me that and for my client, that this photograph be about the relationships, not just about two women, it's about two women in that landscape. And it had to show the harshness of that landscape. So I got down on my belly and I shot along the ground, so you get all that out of focus, but very obviously rocky terrain, inhospitable, not the kind of place you think, I'm gonna plant a crop here. On the left, just in focus, is a thorn bush. And then you've got these two women, they're talking to each other, but sandwiched up quite apparently near to, quite dominant in the frame, though not overpowering, is a range of mountains. And they give context. My client was very insistent that the context be in these photographs. They couldn't just all be wide angle lens, pushed up close, all about personality. They had to be about more than that. Some of my photographs were like that. But I needed some rhythm. I needed a little bit more in my photographs, and it was really important the mountains were there. And if I had gone up to these women with my, even a 50 lens, 50 millimeter, got nice and close, and did a portrait of them, the mountains in the background would not factor into this photograph. They'd be very small. And if I'd used my 16 millimeter lens, they'd be a ripple on the horizon. You'd barely be able to tell they were there. So it is the use of our optics in terms of what they do, how they behave, whether they give the apparent compression of space or whether they exaggerate things. Back to my 16 millimeter lens, the look at the shadows on the left side, on the right side of this frame. They're exaggerated. They're great energy. If I had backed up with a longer lens, those lines would have lost much of their energy. They would have been compressed, flattened, whatever word you want to use. What was important in this photograph was that water coming out of the well. Yes, it was the woman. Yes, it was the well itself and the mood, and those were all important. But the most important was this photograph had to be about those things and the water, that clear, clean water that you can almost, you feel like you're right there. You could reach out and touch it and drink it. And that was the point of this. I could not have accomplished this with a different focal length. This was made with 16 millimeters. Yes, 15 millimeters would have worked, 17 would have worked, but the further away you got from this specific focal length, the more the elements would have changed in relationship to each other, the more the energy would have changed, and the more the messaging, what this photograph was about, that clear water, I need to be able to get right in there. The camera's actually in the structure of the well. I've flipped my screen down, and it's in the well. I'm as close as I can get without, things getting wet. This lens behaves differently than any of my other lenses. And so you choose your lens based on how it behaves and what it says and what it feels like. And all of your lenses will feel differently depending on how you use them in the context that you're using them. Okay, what's the energy? I've got two more that I want to go through, and this one will be fairly quick, but I think it's important that we understand that we respond to energy in a photograph. We see an energetic photograph, we respond a little more energetically. We see one that's very serene, we feel about that photograph more serenely. And so asking yourself, what is the energy in this? And do I need to make choices that will diminish some of that energy to make it more serene? Or do I need to amplify some of that more dynamic energy? And sometimes that's emotional, sometimes it's color, sometimes it's the lines. There's so many ways that we experience energy, the choice of moment. But just asking yourself, what is the energy here and what can I do to amplify it or change it or diminish it? In this case, the energy is kind of nervous, right? You've got a soldier, he's got a gun, he's wearing fatigues. The context seems to be, especially that gritty black and white treatment, seems to be very, there's some tension there. And that's a kind of energy. This photograph is of the same gentleman after he relaxed a little. The last one, he's just nervous. He's just nervous, but you don't necessarily know that. All you read is this kind of, and let's face it, a nervous guy with a gun is not a good energy. But this, suddenly he's laughing. There's a different kind of energy. And so you've got to ask yourself, is that the energy that I want? Do I need to wait for a different moment? What are people going to feel about this? And is that what I want them to feel about it? And do I need to change that in some way? This is a great example of energy. You get lots of energy from this. Hands raised, so your choice of moment. When the hands come up in the dance, or when the garment kind of flaps up in the wind, when the people that are in the circle just separate long enough for that sunburst to come through. It's a low point of view, so now with the wide-angle lens, the people are appearing to lean in a little, so you get diagonality of line. There's more energy there. But if the energy was really important, and this image I used in a body of work that was all black and white, but the client file that I delivered looked like this. It was bright, colorful, and if that dynamic energy is important, you might want to warm it up a little bit. Warmer colors have more energy visually than cooler colors. And so just that one choice in the post-production gave better expression to a more energetic scene. A photograph that was partly about that energy has to have energetic expression in order to make it really truly about that energy. All right, one more. Where is the contrast? When we start in photography, we hear the word contrast, and very often it is used to talk about tonal contrast. So the difference between the brightest parts of our image and the darkest parts, between the whites and the blacks. And high contrast would be no grays in the middle. Low contrast would just be a lot of grays. But there are kinds of contrast that go beyond that, go beyond, say, a color contrast, and those are all important. But what about a contrast of ideas? You remember I showed you that picture right at the beginning of the couple in the window in Venice, contrasted or juxtaposed against that single solitary guy. That's contrast, that's juxtaposition. In this case, there are different kinds of contrast. There's the contrast of many versus one, so lots of little fishes versus one, but also little versus big. So all of those fish are quite small, but then you get this big tuna. You've got the contrast of predator and prey. You've got the contrast of species. You've got a human diver and a bluefin tuna. And so you've got this beautiful set of contrasts, and they drive the messaging of the photograph. And you notice how big that tuna is in part because of all those little fish. If those fish weren't there, if the little small bait fish weren't there, and it was just the man and the tuna, you would get a sense of the size, but not quite the same. And if you took the diver away, you wouldn't know really how big this fish was. You'd have no frame of reference, no size. So contrast, if you want something to look really big, you include elements that are known frames of reference, but that are smaller. And you can change the messaging with contrast too. So for example, if I'd gone around the other side of this scene and photographed this diver in the foreground, the tuna would be in the background. The diver would now be much bigger, the tuna would be much smaller, and the messaging would be totally different. Now the human would appear to be dominant in the scene, and the fish would be not necessarily an afterthought, but maybe if what you're trying to communicate is the presence of human threatening the ocean, that bigger human implies greater impact. So you might want to change up that the contrast and make one bigger and the other smaller. This is, I think, a solid example of contrast or juxtaposition as well. These are Turkana women. Again, we're in the far north of Kenya. And the Turkana women are, apart from the fact that many of them carry cell phones with them, they lead a life that they've lived for thousands of years. And so they're gathering natural or ancient fuel, firewood. In the background, very close, compressed up against them, is a wind farm. So you've got these wind turbines, so a very modern form of energy or fuel. And it's that contrast that drives this story, and the fact that the women are in the frame, about as big as the windmills. There's a tension between which one's going to win. If the windmills were quite small, A, you wouldn't really notice them, and B, the women would be more important. The firewood would be the message here, but it's not. It's the verses. It's the windmill versus the fire. It's the tuna versus the diver. It's anytime you can put the word versus in there. So organic versus inorganic, hot versus cold. These are contrasts, big versus small. Landscape photographers use scale all the time. That's what scale is a contrast of size. And we get drawn to the differences and things. So when I was asking the question, how can I make this contrast stronger? I put a 300 millimeter lens on and I backed up so that that background would appear larger and gain more mass in the frame and exaggerate that contrast. One more. This is shot from just a street corner, and I was just sat there watching the world go by and photographing this gentleman with his newspaper. But the photographs that I was making of this man with his newspaper were just, there was a lot of space between him and I. There wasn't a lot of depth in the photograph. But I really wasn't getting, there was no contrast. There was nothing that sort of drove the story forward. But the minute that I started paying attention to the things that were going on right in front of my face, I started thinking, if I could slow the shutter enough, if I could introduce something moving, now I have a contrast. I have a contrast of moving versus stationary, and I think that kind of contrast drives the story forward. In this case, yes, it also gives depth. There's some sub-framing here, the frame within a frame, but it's that contrast between the fast-moving subject and the not-moving subject. The not-moving subject makes the fast-moving subject appear faster, and the faster-moving subject makes the stationary one appear even more stationary or still. So think about that in terms of the photographs you're making. Can you introduce or exaggerate or maximize, or in some cases diminish or minimize the contrast in the scene in order to make it a photograph that's not just of something, but about the specific thing you're trying to point to, that you're saying, hey, look at that. This is the final photograph in our time together, and it's, I think, a great example of contrast. You've got this, there's color contrast, of course. You've got this cool temperature in the foreground, warmer in the background, and it creates depth. That's wonderful. But the messaging, I think, is pushed forward by the contrast of ideas. You've got a man in the foreground reading, and you don't need to know this detail. He's reading a Christmas Mass at this pilgrimage in Lalibela. But he's lit by the light of a modern technology, and the people in the background are lit by the light of an ancient technology. And it pushes the story forward. It makes us more interested. It makes us lean in. As respondents to a photograph, we notice and are drawn to differences. And the more you can play with those differences as creative opportunities, the more opportunity you will have to make a photograph that is more than just of something, but about something. Thank you so much for giving me the privilege of spending this last hour and 20 minutes with you. It has been, I hope you can tell that if there's one thing that I'm enthusiastic about, it's about this craft and the way that it's so much more than merely technical, but can be, I think, profoundly human. And you giving me the opportunity to spend this time with you is a privilege that I don't take for granted. If you want to get a hold of me, you can find me and more of my photography at davidduchemin.com. You can find some of my resources at craftandvision.com. And if you're interested in the heart of the photograph, you can, of course, get that on amazon.com, any of the online retailers, or I'm very sure your local brick and mortar store would be very happy to order it in for you. Thank you so much for the time we've spent together. We'll talk soon. Hey, before I let you go completely, I have been doing this lecture for over 2 years for camera clubs from at least 24 different countries. And what has always surprised me, because at the end of these, we were doing them by Zoom calls. By the end of these things, we would do a short question and answer period. And what was amazing to me was almost inevitably, the questions always kind of ended up being very much the same. And so I've taken the top, I think, 8 questions and thought that I would kind of give you a little bit of extra time and assume that among you, some of you were curious about these same things. So I've got a set of questions on my iPhone here that I'm just going to read through, and we'll talk about them, and hopefully we won't go too much longer than about 20 minutes. The first question that I get very often, especially because I've presented images in both color and black and white, and I love black and white. The first question is, how do you think about black and white? How do you make those decisions? How do you decide whether an image is black and white or color? And how do you process your black and white images? And I could do a whole seminar on that alone, but my thought process for black and white and color photographs, it comes back to this idea often of what the photograph is about. And if, while I'm asking myself, what is this scene? What is this particular image about? And part of that answer is, it's about the color. It's about the color relationships, or about the vibrance or the intensity, or maybe even the symbolism of a certain color or series of colors. Then, of course, the color stays. But color is very emotionally seductive. Color is very visually seductive. It's a bit of a bully sometimes. And in the natural world, we don't always have the luxury of choosing our colors. And so very often, if the subject is not, if it's not about color for me, then, and more often then, of course, it's about something else. It's about line or shape or texture or the story. And I just feel that the color isn't adding, then I will usually take the color away. I will sometimes play with the colors and sort of snap them to a better palette. Sometimes I will remove them entirely. And when it comes to how I do my black and white work, I favor kind of nudges to clarity and texture. As you've seen, most of my work is quite high contrast because I love, my first films were Tri-X and T-Max, and they were kind of contrasty black and white films. And I love that look. And I have found that I get it best, though I can replicate it in Photoshop and Lightroom. Most often I go to Nik Silver Efex Pro because it has a kind of a gritty granularity to it that I have not yet been able to reproduce in Lightroom or Photoshop. And the other thing, of course, is I might already know that I'm working in black and white just because, well, by virtue of it being a series or a body of work that is already in black and white. So if I'm working on something from India that I know is in black and white, then I default to black and white. I still shoot a color raw file, so I have all that information, but I will turn my viewfinder to black and white most often, so I can see what it looks like, what those tonal relationships are. But I keep all that color information so that I can, for example, make the reds a darker black or a lighter black or gray. I can make the blues a little bit lighter or darker. I have that control. So that's how I handle black and white. The second question is, when you are initially editing a new batch of images, how do you decide what the moment is? So maybe that second question I think I asked, when is the moment, but also where is the moment? And this is where your understanding of composition comes in. This is where your understanding of, again, what the image is about really matters. When you're choosing that image in the edit, and you're choosing that final frame, knowing what this is about for you, and then just asking yourself, does this frame give the best expression to that thing, that action, that story, that relationship? Is maybe one frame just feels the balance is a little better, or the tension's a little better? Maybe one has got all these questions, right? Maybe one has more energy or has a different kind of energy. Maybe in one, the light is just a little bit better. And so this is partly about moment, but it's kind of about the intersection of all of these things. And I think that's because we don't always know in the moment. That's why I think you've got to spend extra time, and why you've got to make a few extra frames, so that you can make some of those decisions with the camera to your eye, but you give yourself more possibilities if you also acknowledge that you'll be doing some of that later in the edit. So the third question: how many frames do you make on a trip? And that's totally depends on the trip, and of course how long the trip is. But I'll give you an example. I came back from Kenya at the beginning of February 2022, and I had been there for a full month, and I shot 30,000 frames. So that's 30 days of shooting, 30,000 frames. That's a pretty accurate average for me, is 1,000 frames per day. But remember, this is out all day, photographing all day. And if I'm photographing wildlife, that's higher. So the safari trip was, if I'd gone to India and I was photographing people, I would probably be closer to 500 to 800 frames a day. But again, I'm photographing on a slower continuous shutter or burst mode. And I'm looking to do a lot of that creative process in the edit. And there's no awards given to coming home with lots of space left on your hard drive. So I feel like I'm stacking the deck in my favor if I just make a lot of photographs. Many of them won't work, but a few of them will. And it's those few that I'm looking for. The others really don't matter, especially if I need to make them in order to kind of get the creative juices flowing and to experiment and risk. I think experimentation and risk is important in photography, and to do that, you really need to make a lot more frames. So the next question is, how do you choose a series from many photographs without decision paralysis or fatigue? And this follows nicely on that last question, because if you are making a lot of frames and you're committed to the process of what I call making sketch images and spending more time in the edit, and I say spend more time, but actually my editing process is pretty quick. It's more about spending more focus and attention and knowing what you're after. I'm very binary. For me, I don't do I don't go through my Lightroom catalog and give them 1 stars, 2 stars, agonize over, whether it's a 3-star or a 4-star, because I'm not looking for those. I am looking for the absolute best. I'm looking for the image that jumps out at me and it makes me lean in and go, ooh, look at that one. So I'm not looking, a 3-star for me is not a hell yes. A 3-star is a yawn, and I'm not looking for those. So I can very quickly go through, and when they grab me, they really grab me. But I also never trust my first edit. So I will do multiple edits. I will go back a week after I come home and I've already done that first edit in the field. I will do a whole second edit, and usually a whole third or fourth edit. And the reason I do that, and I space them out, is because, one, I don't trust that first edit, because I'm always looking for something, right? I have a particular project in mind, I have a particular output. Maybe it's in a magazine article, maybe it's a series of prints, maybe it's a web gallery. But 6 months from now, I might be looking through totally different filters. I might, instead of looking for images for a black and white series, be looking for individual color images that work really well. And I didn't even notice them when I was editing for a black and white series. So that's one of the, well, actually it's a number of the ways that I avoid that paralysis or fatigue. And the other thing is I almost never delete, so that I know that I can go back. It's not a heart-wrenching, sacrifice your darling's decision, because I know that I can go back in a week and I can choose different images and I can revisit images if I want to. All right, what suggestions do you have if we don't know what we want to say in our photographs? And I love this question. This one comes up almost every time. And I think it's really important because, of course, you can only say so much in one presentation. I talked a lot about expression, giving the best expression to what your photograph is about, to your true subject. But I think a lot of the work that goes on with a camera, especially when it's in hand and we're making photographs, it comes before the expression, and that's exploration. I need to explore before I express. So that act of making all those sketch images is kind of rubbing the dirt off and getting to the good stuff. It's like, think of it sometimes as digging. I'm kind of shoveling the junk away to find what it's really about for me. I very rarely look at a scene and go, oh, I know exactly what this is about. Often, as I shoot through the scene, what it's about changes. My own observations, my own reactions, what's going on in the actual scene may change. So it's really, I think if you give yourself a bit of a break, don't put all that pressure on like, oh, I've got to figure out what it's about before I can start shooting. You don't. You just need to explore and experiment and try things out as it comes up. And very often, my best work, if I shoot through a sequence and I make 100 sketch images, when I edit, I actually start at the back and go forward, go backwards, so that I start with the most recent, the latest, and usually the best of my sketch images, because that's where the good stuff usually is. So don't be afraid to explore. Don't worry too much about expression if you're not quite there yet. You will figure it out. It's more important that we ask the questions than that we find a specific answer to the questions, I think. All right, this one's about people. How do you break the ice with someone that you meet on the street while making their portrait? And the one that always follows up from that is, do you get model releases? So I'll clear that one up right away. For my uses, unless a client specifies a model release, I just don't get them. It gets in the way of my process, and of course it will restrict what I can do with those photographs, I acknowledge that, but I'm very picky that the people that I photograph generally, as best I can, that they know that I'm photographing them and that they have given some kind of consent. I will wait until they acknowledge me, and then I'll say, hey, is this okay? If there's no opportunity for that, for example, if I'm in a church, a mosque, a temple, something like that, I'm not going to interrupt them. I will, if I can, wait, like that Buddhist monk I told the story about in Kathmandu. I waited because I knew he was going to look up. He was, right in front of me, and I asked him. But sometimes you don't want to disturb the scene, and you can start making photographs quietly, respectfully. But the minute they do acknowledge me, I acknowledge them. I smile, I nod, I make whatever gesture is appropriate in that culture, and I will tap my camera and just say, is this okay? And if they say yes, I continue to photograph. And if they say no, not only do I stop photographing, but I won't use those images, because it's very important to me that people have an opportunity to say no, and of course also to say yes. Do you pre-plan or pre-visualize your photographs? I love this question because when Ansel Adams talks about, you read about Ansel Adams talking about visualizing his photographs, and I haven't got the foggiest idea what he's going on about. I suspect I know what he's talking about, but he used a very different technology than I do. I have an immediate feedback loop on my camera. I can look at what I'm photographing and I can see what it looks like through this lens, through not only this particular optic, but in a certain point of view, and the exposure. I can see not only what it looks like on the screen, but I can see my histogram. And so no, I don't generally pre-visualize. I know what I want an image to feel like a lot of the time. But again, this comes back to that question about, what if you don't know what you want to say? For me, exploration is so important. And so the next question is, and it's connected here, do you plan ahead when traveling? Or do you just, show up? And the answer, yeah, I just show up because I love the exploration. I will do a very little research in the sense that if I'm going to Cairo, for example, or Kathmandu is a great example. I know the kind of place, I know what is attracting me to go there. So for Cairo, I would be very interested in old Islamic Cairo, spend time in the mosques and in the souks and the little alleys, much less interested in some of the other stuff. And I think because we can only do so much with our time, and I value a lot of time, I would go and I would just spend time in that one neighborhood. That would be about the extent of my research. I would try to find a hotel that was within walking distance so that every morning I could be up early, I could walk to where I want to go, I could get lost in the streets. But the rest is all, because you don't know, the books are going to tell you, oh, you really have to go here, 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 and here, and they'll give you a list. But there are no magic places. There are magic coincidences of events. That one guy happened to show up at that one obscure corner that no guidebook has ever mentioned in this one particular light and weather, and that's when the magic happens. It is rarely true that one makes something approaching an iconic photograph in that iconic spot. It just doesn't happen as much, and you will be flooded with other photographers and the expectations of, well, why doesn't this photograph look like something from, Cartier-Bresson or Steve McCurry or Ansel Adams, or you have all those expectations. And I think one of the things that blinds photographers the most is expectation. We expect it's going to look like this, and so we get there and, oh, the light's not right. Oh, it's the light was bad. Well, the light's not bad or good. It just is what it is. It will, in some circumstances, give you things that it won't in others. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to use that? And if you've got that one particular shot in mind, you're going to be much less creative. You're going to be blocked because you're going to be thinking about what the scene isn't rather than what it is and what it can give you. And I think anything that gets in the way of us being more observant and present and creative, thinking, how can I work with what I've got here? You may come back with images that are totally different, I hope you do, than what you expected. And I think you can only do that to the degree that you're really observant and open to things, and too much preparation, depending on what you're doing. If you're a National Geographic photographer, you got a specific story, you got a specific client brief, of course, you're going to do the preparation that you need to do. But if you're asking me how much preparation I do, almost none, because I love the exploration, and the more prep I do, the less exploration I feel like I get to do. I like to be guided by my curiosity. I hope that's helpful. I have so enjoyed spending this time with you, and I know it's through the medium of video, but I imagine you on the other side, and it's people like you with a fire for this craft, and we share that. They get me excited. I love what I do, and I hope it comes through. Please don't forget to remember to go to yourbonusresources.com and get those PDFs that I mentioned. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, of course, you can always do so at davidduchemin.com or craftandvision.com. Thanks so much. Take care.